And Iran and the tense encounters in the Persian Gulf. New video showing Iranian speedboats swarming U.S. Navy and Coast Guard ships. The U.S. Navy firing warning shots. Here's our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, tonight.
It was pitch black in the Persian Gulf as the armed Iranian patrol boats sped towards the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard vessels, ignoring multiple verbal warnings and blaring horns. It was not until the Iranians got within 68 yards of the U.S. vessels that the U.S. fired warning shots. That streak of light you see, that the three Iranian boats finally turned around. This is the second time this month that the Iranians have swarmed U.S. vessels, the U.S. Navy saying the Iranians are conducting aggressive, unsafe, harassing maneuvers without due regard for the safety of other vessels as required by international law. These two encounters, the first time Iranian boats have harassed the U.S. in over a year.
There are hardliners who don't want the nuclear talks between the U.S. and Iran to succeed, so they're stepping up the pressure, trying to provoke a fight that will derail those talks.
And David, these aggressive and sudden encounters are exactly the kind that can lead to mistakes and escalation.
Well, speaking of news we haven't been paying enough attention to, the United States and Russia appear to be heading toward some kind of conflict. The White House has called Russia a national emergency. Are we moving toward conflict, and why exactly? Glenn Greenwald, thanks for coming on tonight. So, simple question. Do we appear to be moving toward some kind of conflict with Russia, and if so, why?
The relationship between the U.S. and Russia is clearly at its low point since any time, at least since the Cold War. There's no little doubt about that. You ask any analyst and they'll tell you that. And the reason, I think, is twofold. One is that during Russiagate and this whole hysteria that surrounded it, there was this propaganda campaign to convince a huge part of the population, namely liberals and Democrats, that Russia posed this existential threat to the United States, and they believe it to the point where they think that everything we can do against Russia, we ought to do, and if you even stand up and question it, as we're doing now, it probably means that you're some kind of spy for the Kremlin, which is, I'm sure, what people are going to be saying about this segment. But the other part of it is the war on terror is winding down. We're not in Iraq anymore. We're coming out of Afghanistan, and so the question is, how do you keep weapons manufacturers who exert huge amounts of influence and power in Washington with the business where the government keeps using taxpayer money to buy weapons that don't do any good for anyone? Remember, the person who Biden tapped to run the Pentagon, Lloyd Austin, literally came right from the board of directors of Raytheon. And the answer always can be Russia. If you scare enough people to believe that Russia poses a threat to their way of life, they'll agree to keep giving more and more money to the military budget in the name of deterring or stopping them.
So why isn't, since Russia is a nuclear-armed power and part of a very powerful axis internationally, why isn't there more discussion about the degradation of our relations with Russia, that we're moving towards something bad? Why aren't we talking about this?
Well, it's interesting. You know, this is one of those times where it's useful to go back a little bit in history before 2017. We're often told history doesn't begin until 2017. But there was a huge bipartisan pressure campaign on President Obama to send lethal arms to Ukraine. And all you have to do is look at a map or history of how Russia was almost twice destroyed in the 20th century to see the crucial importance of Ukraine to Russia. But Obama's point was correct, which was it has no crucial importance to us. So why would we want to risk confrontation with the nuclear armed power over Ukraine? And I think the reason why people don't question it is because they're afraid that if you stand up and say it's not worth U.S. lives, U.S. treasure, or any kind of U.S. interest to protect Ukraine from Moscow, you get accused of being an apologist for the Kremlin or someone serving Russian interests. And that's become a very powerful political weapon that shapes our discourse and is affecting all aspects of our policy.
Name-calling is a form of social control, and a very effective one.
Early morning gunfire echoes across a stretch of the Salween River along the border between Myanmar and Thailand. This video from the Thai side appears to show Karen National Union fighters taking over a Myanmar army outpost, then burning it to the ground. It's some of the most intense fighting between ethnic armies and Myanmar's military since the coup nearly 3 months ago. The Karen fighters are one of about 24 ethnic minority forces that have been fighting the Myanmar military for decades, seeking greater autonomy. Like the Karen rebels, many of them have thrown their support behind the anti-coup protest movement that has swept across Myanmar since the takeover. There's been talk about forming a federal army. Airstrikes from the military on Karen-held territory have increased over the last few weeks, at one point sending hundreds across the border into Thailand seeking refuge and medical attention. 24,000 people have been displaced since late last month, according to Karen groups. Some protesters are taking their battle against the junta from the streets to the jungle. This footage appears to show a training camp run by ethnic armies preparing those who want to transition from protester to fighter. While there are still protesters dedicated to taking their call for the junta to step down to the streets, but in smaller numbers because of the intensified crackdown by security forces